Rocketdyne had built several facilities for static testing of the F-1 engines. The Bravo Stand Test Facility at Santa Susana Field Laboratory was used for the F-1 components testing. But because of the noise and close proximity to housing, future static tests of the F-1 engines were conducted at Edwards Field Laboratory, away from civilian and of course out of sight of the public and the media. And although F-1 engine static tests were subsequently done, that's a far cry from actual flight hardware and from using a cluster of F-1 engines in actual spaceflight missions using the Saturn V. It is also difficult to determine or access the power output data of the F-1 engine static tests leading up to the first Saturn V launch. There was even less testing in actual flight conditions using the F-1 engines in the Saturn V, which will be discussed in the next section. As has been previously mentioned, Apollo 6, the unmanned second launch of the Saturn V, experienced several problems during its mission. Unlike the first launch of the Saturn V, which had been almost flawless, this mission ran into difficulties from the very beginning. The reasons was pogo oscillations, which caused various degrees of damage. During the first stage flight, the panel of the payload fairing separated because of vibration and expanding moisture in the structure. While the second stage was operating, failures in the fuel lines caused 2 of the 5 engines to shut down prematurely, which resulted in the third phase of the payload reaching suboptimal orbit. Instead of the desired circular orbit at 118 miles, it achieved an elliptical orbit with a lowest point of 107 miles. The above quote gives the impression that it was anything but the fault of the F-1 engines, instead blaming the problem on the pogo oscillations of the Saturn V. If Apollo 6 had been an actual mission, it would not have been able to proceed on its trajectory to circumnavigate the Moon, given that it did not reach optimal orbit. Further, any attempt to increase its orbit in the last-minute attempt to salvage the mission would have been out of the question anyways, as the third stage J2 engine also failed. In analyzing documents for the J2 engines, as well as photos of the Apollo 6 launch, Chenkov observes, various documents and others state that the Apollo 6 and the Apollo 13 had problems with the J2 engines on the second and third stages. The J2 papers mention several cases of cooling tube breakthroughs, but in the available F1 documents there is no such information. At the same time, on the picture of the Apollo F1 flight, it is obvious that 1 or more F1 motors of the first stage are burning. Kerosene is leaking, catching fire, and forming a huge tail of flame and soot. Thus, it turns out that NASA, for whatever reason, has not provided complete information about these F1 problems. Considering that the Apollo 6 damage, essentially related to the design of the F1 engine, occurred 7 months before the Apollo 8 mission, and it can be concluded that there was no time for fine-tuning of the engine to the declared characteristics. NASA has inferred that it was the pogo oscillations that caused the F1 engine problem, when in fact it was the opposite. A problem with the F1 engines caused the pogo oscillations, but now we can learn that there were problems with the J2 engines as well. This is another significant point, since the J2 engines would have been needed to boost the Saturn V to LEO and the trajectory for the Moon mission. As further stated in Ivgenkov's article, NASA may have attempted to utilize the full power of the F1 and J2 engines with Apollo 6, which led to numerous problems after launch, which required the reduction of power to minimize damage and prevent an explosion. The irony here is that it was most likely the design of the tubular cooling system that was responsible for the combustion chamber instability, which prevented the use of full power in the F1 engines and inevitably prevented an explosion on Apollo 6 during launch. Therefore, for a successful mission, and in the absence of problems experienced with Apollo 6, the initial thrust of the F1 engines, if they were used, needed to have been throttled back, defeating the F1 engine's stated purpose, which was to launch the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit for a manned lunar landing mission. Any power in the F1 engines lower than what NASA has stated would have meant that there were no manned moon landings, meaning all Apollo missions outside of LEO were faked. Apparently, after solving the instabilities of the F1 engine combustion chamber, the actual cause of the problem seems to remain elusive. The spontaneous combustion instabilities never reappeared. Until the end, however, the problem was never completely understood. To this day, it remains a constant problem in the large rocket engines for which an individual empirical solution has to be found. To the disappointment of the engineers, a model was never found in which they could generally overcome the problem. NASA admits it did not know what caused the problems with the F1 engines, yet it says the problem was overcome as they worked perfectly during the Apollo missions. However, after 1973, the remaining F1 engines were never used again. The issue is not whether the F1 engines existed or not, as there's evidence that they did, and NASA even has the F1 engines in storage and on display in museums. The issue is whether or not they had the required power output, as NASA claims, and whether they were used in the Saturn V. The preponderance of the evidence now shows that the F-1 engines didn't have the power output needed to launch the hardware to low Earth orbit for a successful manned lunar landing. The next mission after Apollo 6 using the Saturn V was Apollo 8. As previously mentioned, Apollo 8 was the first manned mission of that vehicle and the first manned mission to leave low Earth orbit to circumnavigate the Moon. All of the problems experienced with Apollo 6 were seemingly solved in just 7 months. However, as Evgenkov points out, 7 months would not have given Rocketdyne and NASA enough time to have worked out the problems that were observed with Apollo 6. He further states that Apollo 6 may have actually been the first and last mission of the Saturn V to use the 5 F-1 engines. Gennady Evgenkov concludes, the pressure in the F-1 combustion chamber is likely to have been significantly lower than stated due to the fundamental shortcomings of the tubular cooling system of American rocket engines. This is further confirmed by the fact that all rocket engines now being developed and currently in use, including those in the United States, use the Soviet-styled cooling system. Consequently, the launch weight of the Saturn V was lower and accordingly could not have ensued the accomplishments of the Apollo moon landing program. Nevertheless, although the F-1 engines produced smoke, they worked. They were not exploding in front of the public and were delivering something to somewhere. In general, we can express admiration for the Rocketdyne engineers who managed to get at least some characteristics of this miracle in an American mastermind, the F-1, as even 500 tons of thrust per chamber is still quite a lot. The true F-1 design and its characteristics apparently were significantly different from those stated. To reiterate, NASA no longer uses a cooling system in its rocket engines that worked seamlessly perfect during the Apollo moon missions from 1969 to 72, preferring instead to use a Soviet-style cooling system. As would have been expected, Super 8 films by spectators were taken of the Apollo 11 launch. The question is, do any of these old Super 8 films still exist? Yes, they do, and it was one of these films that was analyzed by Alexander Popov and Andrei Bulatov. However, the first thing that comes to mind is the authenticity of the amateur film and whether it had been edited or tampered with. This could have been easily established through a verification process that included checking for splices throughout, indicating editing of the film. This is exactly what the authors of this article have done, Alexander Popov and Andrei Bulatov. The vast majority of the amateur films and NASA's recordings available on the internet show the ascent of the Saturn V compiled and edited from separate clips assembled from individual sequences. What makes this particular amateur film interesting is that it was filmed continuously for 175 seconds during the launch of Apollo 11 to the first stage separation of the Saturn V and its F-1 engines. That makes this film an excellent source for comparison to the official film footage provided by NASA to the media. The amateur film analyzed by Popov and Bulatov was originally filmed by Phil Palacia on the morning of the Apollo 11 launch. As you will see in Palacia's background below, he was a very credible witness. Phil has a bachelor's degree from Louisiana Tech University and a master's degree from Auburn University, both in mathematics. He worked at IBM for NASA. He had the opportunity to become a controller during the Gemini 7 to 5, the first Rendezvous Gemini 8, the first emergency re-entry, and Apollo 11. After Gemini, he became the IBM lead manager for Apollo, Skylab, and Apollo Soyuz. Phil himself shot the film on a Super 8 film camera. The shooting and playback speed has not been changed. The Apollo launch footage is one continuous shot without cuts and with no editing. Phil is now around 71 years old. As for Phil Palacia's motivation in filming the launch of Apollo 11, according to Phil's account, the company sent him on a special trip to observe the launch of the Apollo 11. He shot the film on a Super 8 camera. His commentaries of the launch are the words of admiration and a sincere belief of this historical event, the missions to the moon. Associated long-term work for NASA and honestly convinced in the reality of the missions to the moon, Phil obviously had neither incentive nor motivation to shoot revelatory material. He simply filmed what he saw. This fact makes his material even more unprejudiced and more valuable in exposing NASA's account, which has come to light following analysis of his film. During launch, Apollo 11 cleared the tower in 9.5 seconds. As part of the verification process of the film, other films of the same launch were checked to see if the Apollo 11 launch matched the time clearance of the tower as in the film footage provided by NASA. All of them did, including Palacia's film. On the morning of the launch of Apollo 11, the sky was described as being a whitish translucent haze of high cirrostratus clouds. According to Palacios film, Apollo 11 passed through the high cirrostratus clouds at 105 seconds. High cirrostratus clouds are approximately 2,600 feet in altitude. The problem is that at 105 seconds, Apollo 11 should have been at 79,000 feet, not 26,000 feet as shown on Palacios film footage. That means that there were either multiple failures of the F1 engines or the F1 engines were not even used. Either way, Apollo 11 could not have reached optimal orbit for translunar insertion, which means that there was no landing on the lunar surface. In fact, at this velocity and height, it's unlikely that Apollo 11 even made it into low Earth orbit. With such a start to the flight, the Apollo 11 craft had no chance of catching up with the required ascent schedule, states the veteran of Baikonur Cosmodrome NV Lebedev. Indeed, according to NASA's records, the burn of the first stage of the Saturn V is about 60% of the 120 seconds. Respectively, by the 106th second, the first stage has burnt out 60% of its fuel, and it has made less than 1/8 of its required journey. After studying the film footage, the authors state that the 105th second into the launch, Apollo 11 was 3 times behind NASA's actual ascent record, and at 107 to 109 seconds, the rocket traveled 9 times slower than it should have done, according to the NASA record. Therefore, based on the results, Apollo 11 had no working spacecraft and therefore no astronauts on board. It also did not have the power to reach low Earth orbit and instead ended up in the Atlantic Ocean once out of range of the media. G.H. Pogrovsky, Ph.D., comes to similar conclusions with the official Apollo 11 film footage. S.G. Pogrovsky conducted a frame-by-frame analysis of the official Apollo 11 launch film footage. In his 35-page article, he too determined that the Saturn V first stage separation happened at a lower altitude than what had been stated by NASA. This fact further indicates that there was no payload for a manned lunar landing. In the first approximation, with a velocity deficit of about 1,500 to 1,200 meters per second, it was not possible to put a deficit of 17,000 to 18,000 kilograms into lunar orbit. NASA stated that the mission placed about 46 tons into lunar orbit, 28 tons of which had to be the Apollo craft itself. Since all of our speed estimates are upper bound, the booster payload deficit may have been even higher. Given these obtained estimates, all arguments over what could have been achieved during the Apollo program should take into account that not more than 28 tons, including the Apollo 11 spacecraft itself, out of 46 tons, as stated by NASA, could have been placed into lunar orbit. Pokrovsky comes to a slightly different conclusion by stating that the Apollo 11 reached low Earth orbit, but as with the other scientists in this section, his overall conclusion is that Apollo 11 did not have the necessary hardware on board for a lunar landing. However, if you factor in his liberal speed, upper bound estimates of the Saturn V performance, then by inference, it is the same conclusion as the other scientists, that is, Apollo 11 had no crew and never reached low Earth orbit and instead went into the Atlantic Ocean once out of camera range. The Western scientific community has since tried to counter S.G. Pogrovsky's work with the book Moon Hoax Debunked. Finally, a no-nonsense, fact-filled rebuttal of moon hoax claims for doubters and enthusiasts alike by Paola Atavissimo. It is a book that should be read, as it is important to read both sides of this discussion. Note: you can read Paola Atavissimo's counter-argument regarding the Saturn V's performance in his book on owlist.com. But the exact facts surrounding the performance of the Saturn V can never be determined, since most of the fact-filled documents have disappeared. Minimal testing of the Saturn 1B and Saturn V. As stated, Apollo 4 was the first mission involving the Saturn V, was also the first mission to supposedly have the cluster of 5 F1 engines. There was only one more mission, Apollo 6, which involved the F1 engines, but this mission was plagued with problems. We now know that subsequent missions involving the Saturn V either used reduced power in the F1 engines due to instability of the combustion chamber, or instead used different engines with less power and thrust. Either way, the Saturn V lacked the power necessary for launching the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit for a manned lunar landing. We will now look at the minimal testing of the Saturn V with its F1 engines in the actual conditions of spaceflight. The Saturn B and Saturn V were very different when it came to factors like capabilities on launch, the effects of atmospheric forces, and the trajectory to low Earth orbit and beyond. Hence, both the Saturn 1B and Saturn V cannot be combined in total spaceflight experience since their characteristics are different. Further, it was the Saturn V which contained the F1 engines needed to launch the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit for a manned lunar landing. This makes the overall minimal testing of each of these two Saturn rockets in actual spaceflight, especially that of the Saturn V, all the more startling. Most of the previous missions leading up to the first manned mission involving different components of the Saturn V series, not the complete structure of the Saturn 1B or Saturn V itself. The 20th mission was the first launch of an actual Saturn 1B, and the 23rd mission was the first launch of an actual Saturn V. Both of these missions were unmanned. There were only 5 unmanned missions of the Saturn 1B in actual conditions of spaceflight before the first manned mission of that vehicle with Apollo 7 to low Earth orbit. There were only 2 unmanned missions of the Saturn V with a combined total duration of 19 hours before the first manned mission of that vehicle. But when you look further into the testing of the Saturn V, the first stage with its F1 engines had only a combined total of approximately 4 minutes in actual conditions of spaceflight before the first manned mission of the Saturn V with Apollo 8. This is very surprising since we were led to believe that Apollo 8 circumnavigated the Moon and was apparently a flawless mission. The MFSC had built scale models of both the F1 engines and the first stage of the Saturn V for wind tunnel testing, which were used for simulating launch by decreasing atmospheric pressure from approximately 20 to 37 miles in altitude. Aviation used the same method, but this was always followed by many hours of testing in actual flight conditions, and as we've seen, NASA in no way matched that level of spaceflight testing. This becomes quite obvious when you compare NASA's testing of the F1 engines in actual flight conditions, which amounts to mere minutes, to the testing of each new aircraft in actual flight conditions, which amounts to hundreds of hours. Given NASA's purported proficiency in automation, with numerous unmanned and automated missions to low Earth orbit and beyond, including 2 unmanned missions of the Saturn V, Apollo 8 should have been another unmanned and automated mission, especially given that it was the first Apollo mission to leave low Earth orbit to circumnavigate the Moon. This should have been followed by further automated and unmanned missions using the Saturn V to circumnavigate the Moon in order to accumulate as much data as possible. Data from the Saturn V unmanned missions could have then been studied meticulously, making design modifications where necessary before sending the first manned mission outside of low Earth orbit, therefore increasing the chances of success, like we have been led to believe happened with Apollo 8. This would have been a logical first step. NASA then could have launched a series of unmanned and automated Saturn V's complete with the necessary hardware for lunar landing, again to accumulate as much data as possible. These data from automated lunar landings could have been studied, making any design modifications necessary, increasing the success for the first manned lunar landing, as we were led to believe happened with Apollo 11. This would have been a logical second step. Although there had been unmanned landing missions on the lunar surface by both the Americans and the Soviets at that time, it is important to note that up to the Apollo 11 mission, there was nothing of that magnitude of an Apollo 11 landing. It would have made sense to have numerous unmanned and automated landings with the LM on the lunar surface, aside from computer simulations and the use of the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, LLRV, and the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, LLTV, used by astronauts as part of their training to simulate lunar landings. There will be an in-depth discussion of this in part 2 of this series. Software simulations were limited with 1960s technology, but as NASA claims, they had access to the AGC on the Apollo missions from Mission Control, so they could have easily practiced unmanned lunar landing procedures using the Apollo LM in the actual conditions of spaceflight before the first manned landing. In addition, there were only 4 unmanned missions of the CM and 5 unmanned missions of the SM in the actual conditions of spaceflight before the first manned mission of Apollo 7. The SM would have been a vital aspect of the Apollo missions, given that it was responsible for providing life support systems and propulsion. NASA had 2 vacuum chambers which simulated the vacuum of space large enough to test the CM and SM, but that doesn't compare to the actual conditions of spaceflight in low Earth orbit and beyond. Apollo 8, along with being the first manned mission to use the Saturn V with its cluster of 5 engines, was only the second manned mission of the CM and SM. Further, Apollos 9 and 10 don't amount to much in any way of combined experience for Apollo 11 either. One could argue that the manned Mercury and Gemini space programs should be added in terms of experience along with Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10, which would amount to approximately 2,000 hours of experience in actual conditions of space leading up to Apollo 11. But that experience should only be applied to astronauts in terms of the human experience in space, since it didn't involve the same design and configuration of the Apollo spacecraft, nor did any of the Mercury and Gemini manned missions involving going beyond low Earth orbit. It is the actual missions involving the Saturn V that were paramount. The Saturn V, CM, SM, and LM were more complex in their design, supposedly incorporating new and innovative fly-by-wire technology. Although fly-by-wire technology was already used in the military aircraft at this time, the Apollo missions were the first to use an integrated fly-by-wire computer system. Therefore, when it came to the testing of new technologies, the same standards used in aviation should have been applied to manned space missions, but obviously this was not the case. In addition to NASA using scale models of the F1 engines and the Saturn V, they were also running computer simulations at the same time when software necessary to run computer simulations was limited. And unlike aviation, which has decades of experience behind it, NASA's manned spaceflight missions to low Earth orbit had only a few years of experience, and manned missions beyond low Earth orbit were non-existent. Chapter 3: Navigation and the Apollo Guidance Computer. Has anyone seen Earth? The Apollo mission's method of navigation was what piqued my interest and motivated me to begin my research. It was a method based on celestial navigation that had been used by ships sailing across the oceans for hundreds of years. It is one thing sailing around the world using this method with established geological landmarks and maps, but quite another when you consider the vast distance relative to our technology when making a 480,000-mile round trip in cislunar space. Even with 1960s technology, such as the much-touted Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, which was a fly-by-wire system incorporated into this method of celestial navigation, you'll learn how challenging it would have been to even try navigating in low Earth orbit, let alone a 480,000-mile round trip in cislunar space. The relatively new, for that time, fly-by-wire technology used in the Apollo missions had been in use in the military aircraft since the 1950s, but the fly-by-wire AGC was the first fully integrated system used on any manned mission, let alone in low Earth orbit and beyond. I pared down the description of this technology in the next two sections for a better understanding. Fly-by-wire. Today, fly-by-wire technology has become common in the airline industry. In aircraft, fly-by-wire technology has eliminated the need for hydraulics to move control surfaces like the rudder, elevator, and ailerons. For example, in previous aviation technology, the pilot would make inputs on the control column to activate the hydraulics, which would move or deflect the ailerons on the outside of the wings to bank the aircraft. This technology has now been replaced in new aircraft like Airbus and Boeing. So, when the pilot makes inputs on the control column, he or she is commanding the computer to send a signal to an actuator to bank the aircraft, replacing the need for hydraulics. Since there are no hydraulics, this method should ideally save on weight and fuel costs, although given today's greed among oil companies, those savings are usually nil. The first fully integrated use of a fly-by-wire system with no mechanical or hydraulic backup system was the Apollo Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, LLRV, which was first flown in 1964 and was used for training the Apollo astronauts. The LLRV was configured to simulate the LM in 1/6 gravity for lunar landing practice. This technology was then incorporated into the Apollo spacecraft design. The LM's fly-by-wire system was tested for the first time in actual conditions in low Earth orbit with Apollo 9 in March of 1969. The second test of the fly-by-wire system in actual conditions with the Apollo 10 in lunar orbit to a descent to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface in May 1969. Both of these missions were supposed to have been a test run for Apollo 11. Any and all anomalies with the fly-by-wire AGC managed to be sorted out in just 4 months, with only 2 Apollo missions in the actual conditions of spaceflight. The first civilian aircraft to use fly-by-wire technology was the Concorde in 1969, which entered commercial service in 1976. The manufacturers of Concorde decided to err on the side of caution and tested their aircraft's fly-by-wire system for 6 years before allowing any passengers on board. Apollo Guidance Computer. The AGC was designed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and manufactured by Raytheon. Each Apollo mission had two of these computers, one for the CM and the other for the LM. The AGC evolved from navigating the CM to the Moon and back to a fully integrated fly-by-wire computer system responsible for attitude, the reaction control system, RCS thrusters for trajectory, and the service propulsion engine of the CM. The AGC had three main components. 1. The inertial measurement unit, IMU. 2. The optics containing a sextant and scan telescope. And 3. A computer to integrate the systems including the guidance, navigation and control, GN and C system. The inertial measurement unit. The inertial measurement unit, IMU, was responsible for detecting the internal motion of the spacecraft. It consisted of 3 swivel gimbals which contained spinning gyroscopes to hold them in place as the spacecraft's position orientation changed. The principle is the same as the gyros installed in aircraft flight instruments, especially in general aviation, although this is now being replaced with the new glass cockpit technology, much like the airliners have been doing for the last couple of decades. For example, the attitude indicator in an aircraft is a gyro instrument with an artificial horizon as a reference for the pilot. The attitude indicator remains fixed in reaction to the ground with the aircraft moving around the instrument, therefore giving the pilot pitch, bank, and roll information. With the Apollo spacecraft, this inertial space was in reference to the stars, and given that the Apollo astronauts were military pilots, they requested that a similar instrument be installed in the CM and LM. This was called the Flight Director Attitude Indicator, FDAI, displaying pitch, yaw, and roll angles with the instrument displaying Earth and Moon's horizon to give the astronauts a better sense of orientation. The optics. As part of the navigation system, the Apollo spacecraft had a version of a sextant called the optics, which was used by sailors for hundreds of years to measure angles between the Earth's horizon, the Sun, and the stars. It consisted of a sextant and telescope. The former was an optical instrument capable of measuring angles between two stars. The lens had a 1.6 negative degree true field of view with 28 times magnification and 2 lines of sight used for star sightings, one fixed called the landmark line of sight, LLOS, and one movable called the star line of sight, SLOS. The LSOS swung up to 57 degrees from the fixed line of sight and was used to bring the star sightings into alignment with the Earth's horizon. Usually, 2 star sightings would be sought out and the coordinates fed into the AGC. The telescope part of the optics had a 1 times magnification with a 60-degree true field of view. Since the optics was fixed in position, the AGC would be commanded to position the CSM for star sightings. The Command Module Pilot, CMP, would then aim the telescope at a star and line it up with the sextant. Among programs stored in the memory core of the AGC was a list of angles for 37 bright stars more easily visible to the astronauts. After the CSM was positioned, a program was selected for aligning the IMU. The CMP would then press a switch for the computer to read the angles between star sightings taken by the optics. This would display the angles on the display and keyboard, DSKY, and then used to realign the IMU. From this information, the CMP would obtain the state vector and determine whether a course correction was necessary. This procedure for checking the state vector was done several times on Apollo 11 on the way to the Moon and back.